Hey everybody, I'm Gabe. I'm with Thinking Outside the Long Box podcast. I'll be the moderator, but mostly I think we're just going to have an awesome chat. Do you guys know who this is? I'm pretty sure you do. This is Ron Marz, and I'm so stoked right now.
I'm assuming you didn't just stumble in here because like this is like they literally brought me down like the back alleys and through.
So I have a few questions. I literally have like 3 questions, and then I'm going to open it up to you guys because you guys are here to see him and you want your questions answered way more than you want my questions answered. But Juan needs me to record this. So on our podcast, when we interview comic book writers and artists and stuff like that, we always start off with the same question. What's the origin story of X? And what I want to know from you is what's the origin story of you getting started in the comic books industry?
I am writing comics because Jim Starlin suggested I should write comics. And then when I said, okay, he said, well, I'll teach you how to do it. And then, I'll show you around at Marvel. And that's basically it. When people ask, well, how did you break into comics at a panel or whatever? They're not really asking, how did I break into comics? What they're really asking is, how do I break into comics? Basically, how do I take your job, professional writer? So like the lamest story you can have is, well, Jim Starlin said I should write comics, so I am. Because that's no damn help to anybody that actually wants to break in. But that's my origin story. Is I was friends with Jim and still am, and I was working as a journalist. This is when I was just out of college, and working as a journalist at a daily newspaper, and I copy edited Jim's first prose novel for him, and we were friends already at that point. But I copy edited his prose novel. And he liked what I did well enough that he said, you should think about writing comics as a way to put food on the table. And that's not the sort of offer that you ever refuse. So, Jim literally, showed me how he writes a script, which is how I still write a script 25 years later, and co-wrote some gigs with me at Marvel. And then when he was ready to leave Silver Surfer because he was switching over to do Infinity Gauntlet, he somehow strong-armed Marvel into giving me the book, and I've been working ever since. So I literally have a career because Jim Starlin said I should.
Need to meet Jim Starlin. No, just kidding.
I have had people at like panels and stuff go, Can I get Jim Starlin's number?
So you've done a couple crossover books that I really, really enjoyed. You did Batman Aliens, and then you also did DC versus Marvel. Mm-hmm. And I want to know kind of what was your inspiration behind taking two, Batman is definitely its own singular thing, and Alien is its own singular universe. What was your inspiration behind just let's mash these two things together?
It'd be cool. That's really where the best comics come from is, what would be cool? That was Batman Aliens was a conversation that I had with Bernie Wrightson, who drew Batman Aliens and passed away earlier this year, unfortunately. Let's see who's texting me. Someone in South Africa. That's kind of cool. And Bernie and I were coming back. I was friends with Bernie for years, and I met Bernie at the same time I met Jim because we lived in the same area, and we literally lived a mile and a half down the road from Bernie. So I hung out at his studio a lot. We saw each other 3-4 times a week, and we started to talk about finding a project to work together on. And Bernie's the one that suggested Batman Aliens because Dark Horse had the Aliens license, and I think we were actually coming back from having a couple beers at a tavern in town or something like that. And he suggested Batman Aliens, and I said, well, that sounds really cool. They'll never let us do it, but that sounds really cool. So Bernie called Bob Schreck, who was an editor at Dark Horse at the time, and eventually moved over to become an editor at DC, to pitch him the idea. And to our shock, they said, yeah, that sounds pretty cool. Let's see if we can get 20th Century Fox and DC to agree to it. And lo and behold, Fox and DC both signed on immediately, and then we're like, oh shit, we actually have to come up with a story now. Like, we just, because basically all we had was Batman versus aliens.
I mean, do you really need a whole lot more, though? I mean, you mostly just want to watch Batman beat up aliens.
The high concept, the high concept was, Batman fights some aliens, and ultimately how most things come together is, the writer and artist talk about, well, what do you want to draw? What do you not want to draw? And in Bernie's case, it was he didn't want to draw buildings or cars because that's not something that he really enjoys. I'll mute that because that's a pain in the ass. So I was like, all right, well, how about the jungle? How about the Yucatan? And he was cool with that because that means he just got to make up trees and ruins and stuff like that. And then we ended up kicking around the idea of an alien embryo getting into a crocodile. That's where the big alien croc monster came from.
Seriously, one of my favorite things in comic books of all time. Just I love Bernie Wrightson's one of my favorite artists. Have one of his pieces tattooed on my arm. I have this Swamp Thing.
Oh, very cool.
Yeah, the Swamp Thing cover. So Batman is the only superhero comic book I read. So this mash of oh my God, it's Batman fighting the aliens from the movies, and it's one of my favorite things. The Batman versus Aliens and Batman versus Predator were the two books in middle school that I literally filled one subject notebooks of me trying so hard. For the record, I draw nothing like Bernie Wrightson, but that was what I did all through middle school, was just obsessively try to draw those comic books. So
well, the business, the comics business in the 90s went from boom to bust very quickly. Mid 90s, the speculator market kind of fell apart. A lot of stores were hurting, and publishers were hurting too because they weren't selling many comics. And when sales are bad is when comics companies feel a little bit more charitable toward each other because they have to hang together or they're going to hang separately. So Marvel versus DC very much came out of the fact that sales had tanked and they needed something to keep stores open, to keep their own bottom lines doing well, but also to keep stores open. So one of the reasons that in the 90s you saw so many crossovers was because once the market kind of dropped, and even beforehand when the market was good, okay, we can make some money by putting Batman and aliens together or whatever. But once the market fell apart, companies were doing whatever they could to move some product that retailers could sell. So that's why you saw so many Marvel and DC crossovers at the time, and a bunch of others. And now you don't see those much at all because sales are pretty good. Marvel and DC are both making a buttload of money on movies, so they don't need each other.
Right. So, talk to us a little bit about Emerald Twilight, the Green Lantern story arc. It has a lot of it's very popular, but it has a lot of kind of concepts that maybe weren't necessarily within the realm of Green Lantern. Where did that concept come from? And how did that whole storyline come about?
Emerald Twilight was an editorially driven storyline because the decision was made to move Hal Jordan out of the lead role in Green Lantern and have a new character, and the simplest, shortest reason is because Hal wasn't selling. He was not sales wise, the character was not resonating with the market, and this might come as a shock to you guys, but publishers are in business to make money. So if something's not selling, eventually it changes. It either goes on the shelf and they do something different, or the lead character gets, the creative team gets jacked off the book, or the lead character gets dumped. So Green Lantern was not a seller for DC at the time. Batman getting his back broken and the death of Superman were both huge events that sold really well for DC. So they felt like, okay, it's time to do something with Green Lantern, and they came to me and said, we want you we want you to take over Green Lantern. Because I had worked at Marvel mostly at that point. I was doing Thor, and I think I was still doing Surfer at the time. Yeah. And I thought, wow, that's cool, man. Because that, Hal Jordan's got that Gil Kane costume that just rocks, and he's a test pilot. And they went, oh yeah, wait. So here's what we're gonna do. And it took me about a week, maybe 2 weeks, to decide whether I wanted to take the gig, because it was a fairly big deal story. It was I knew that it was going to ruffle feathers. It was going to be controversial. But I eventually took on the story because I knew if I didn't, somebody else would. And to me, the more interesting part of what we got to do was to make up a new Green Lantern. Once we had told Emerald Twilight and Hal had been removed from the lead role in the book, to me, the more interesting part was, can we make up a Green Lantern that people would care about? Have somebody be that next legacy character that an audience could connect with. So the main plot of Emerald Twilight was sort of handed to me in a page and a half of notes that literally, I probably still have them somewhere. That came through the fax machine, because we weren't really doing a lot of email back then. That was, here are the basic beats of your story, and I had to flesh that out, and it had to be, over and done with in 3 issues, because they wanted to make the change in issue 50. So it was very much when you do something that severe to a character, especially to, what is ultimately kind of a franchise character, you don't just decide to do that and tell the editors, well, I'm gonna boot Hal out of the book and make up a new guy, and they go, oh yeah, that sounds fine. That those kind of stories usually come from above and get handed down to you, which is not to sort of duck responsibility for it or anything like that. It's just to say that those kinds of stories are very much from the creative team, but directed by editorial. And I knew that it was kind of a big deal when I got the call for it, which was after 9 o'clock at night. I actually had been in Marvel's offices for most of the day, wrestling with my Thor editor to try to figure out where we're going to go with the next year of the book, because I was not happy with the first year of the book because it sucked. And I got back that night, and I got a call from the Green Lantern editor, who I had done a couple of short stories for, but they offered me the book, and I realized at that point that not only was the Green Lantern editor on the line, but so were basically the 3 editors that ran DC at the time, which was Denny O'Neil, Archie Goodwin, and Mike Carlin, who are all big deal editors. If those 3 guys are on the phone, either something really good or really bad is going to happen. And for me, it turned out to be something really good. And I also realized that Paul Levitz, who was the publisher at DC, was on the phone as well. So,
the big guys.
This is, I should mind my P's and Q's while we're having this call. So really the story of Emerald Twilight was kind of in place. The broad strokes were in place. And then at the end of that memo, it just said, new Green Lantern is created, and they let us do whatever we wanted with them.
That's cool. So you've written and kind of touched on just almost everything in Marvel and DC. You're kind of this done everything sort of guy. You've been in the business long enough that you've seen almost everything. Is there one property that you haven't touched that you would just love to write?
Marvel or DC property, or any property?
Just any property.
I've gotten to play with most of the toys at one point or another, which is cool. It's awesome. You get to scratch every 12-year-old itch that you ever had. I mean, I got to do Marvel versus DC, which is the story that
it's like the ultimate toy box.
It's the story you want to tell when you're 10 years old. And I literally, I think when I was younger than 10 at the time. I think I had gotten a issue of Justice League off of a spinner rack at a supermarket while my mom was shopping, and it was a JLA issue, might have even been a George Perez issue, and in my 8-year-old wisdom. I thought, what should happen is the Justice League should meet the Avengers, because no one had ever thought of that.
Right.
So
Except for every other 8-year-old kid.
So I ended up writing a letter to Marvel and the same letter to DC saying, you should have Justice League meet the Avengers. So literally, however many years later, 20 or 20, 25 years later, I get to do that. I get to play with all those toys. Any of that stuff is just great. I mean, writing comics is like anything else. It's a job, but it can be the best job in the world. So I have been very fortunate to be able to play with most of the things I wanted to play with. But if, like at Marvel or DC, I would love to do a Dr. Fate book, just because I think Dr. Fate is an awesome character, great visual, and has never really had much of a chance to take a bow. So like at Marvel or DC, love to do Dr. Fate, who I don't think I've actually written Dr. Fate ever. Even, I did Strange Fate for the Amalgam stuff that came out of Marvel versus DC, but I've never actually had a chance to write him, even like in the background of a panel. Huh. So Dr. Fate would be awesome. And then my other, I've written the character before, but my other really unfulfilled ambition is I would love to do a Tarzan book cool. do a monthly run on a Tarzan book for forever, I guess is what, just like till I drop, I would write Tarzan.
I would love to hear some of you guys' questions. Go for it.
And here you are. It's ultimately, first of all, it's really cool that the character's still around and that there's some resonance with the audience and people still care about the character. That's first and foremost. That's awesome. That's the main thing. That's the important takeaway. Darryl Banks and I created Kyle. Darryl being the artist who came up with the design and everything, and DC really kind of let us make him up from whole cloth. They didn't give us a lot of direction at the time. They just said, make up a new Green Lantern. And I said, does it have to be a human? And they went, yeah, we want to keep a Earth lead. And I said, does it have to be a male lead? Can it be a woman? And they said, no, we'd rather keep a male lead on the book. That was the only direction we were given, like at all. So all the rest of it, we just made up. So on the one hand, I feel very sort of close and proprietary to the character because he didn't exist before. We just completely made him up, and he was, I wrote the book for 7 years. He was basically what I intended. He was, we set him up and set him off into the DC universe. So on the one hand, you feel very attached to the character. And on the other hand, that you don't own him. He's not yours. DC will do whatever they want with it. And at some point, you have to give him back. At some point, you're not going to be writing that character anymore. So it's a little bit like putting up your kids for adoption. And you just sort of hope that... not that I've done that, I mean, we did sell one to gypsies, but it was, he kind of deserved it. So that you're going to be handing him back at some point. So you're attached to the character, but you can't. Your heart is attached, but your head can't be attached because it's not yours. So I've seen cool stuff done with Kyle, and I've seen stuff done with Kyle that made me scratch my head. But you just have to accept it. You know that it's not yours, and you just, doing superhero comics, and specifically Marvel and DC comics, you stand on the shoulders of the people that came before you, and the people that come after you stand on your shoulders. And that's just the way it is. So you have to, there were obviously people that didn't like what I did to Hal. There are people that probably don't like some of the things that happened to Kyle. It's just, it's just the nature of doing serial fiction, doing characters that you don't own, that somebody else ultimately makes decisions about. You just have to be accepting of it. And you enjoy the stuff that you feel like is close to what you might have done, and you just kind of shrug and let the other stuff go. I wrote, so Surfer was my first monthly gig. Like I said, when Jim left the book, I assumed there was arm twisting and probably promises that, that if I really screwed the whole thing up, that, they would like Jim would take it back and fix it. If I burned the house to the ground, he would be responsible for fixing it. But that was also like the boom time at Marvel and in the business in general. So, if you were like a trained monkey that could hold a pencil or type, you could get a gig. Thank God that's when I broke in, because books were selling so much, they didn't really give a crap what they were. Like, Silver Sable sold over 1 million copies. What the hell? like most people now don't even know what Silver Sable is, but that was a huge seller for Marvel for a couple of years because of the speculator market. So I wrote Surfer for 5+ years and eventually came to the conclusion that he's a much better supporting character than he is a main character. Because he's an alien and he's somewhat distant and removed from human. Like I said, after writing 50-some issues, I came to the conclusion that I shouldn't really be telling stories about him. I should be telling stories about other people that he's involved with. Because I eventually came to the conclusion that like being too close to the Surfer and being inside his head didn't serve the character as well as sort of maintaining that distance. He should be alien in some ways, but he should also, no pun intended, reflect our humanity back at us. The best science fiction stories always have something to do with what's going on in the here and now. Star Trek stories about space aliens were ultimately about what was going on Earth in the 60s, but they dressed them up in different clothes. So I think if I went back and did Surfer now, I would probably approach it somewhat differently. Visually he's great. I mean, if you describe the character to somebody, well, he's an alien and he's all covered in tinfoil and he flies on a surfboard in space, it sounds stupid. But, with the right artist, it's an awesome visual to get into a book. So I think for the longest time, Marvel hasn't really had a good sense of how to play Silver Surfer. And basically the book that Dan Slott's doing now is basically what if Doctor Who was the Silver Surfer? That's Dan's take on it. I think one of the interesting things about the character is that he's really open to a bunch of different interpretations. A lot of comic book characters kind of are what they are, but I think because Surfer has that alien quality to him and that there's a certain amount of tragedy and angst in his backstory, that he's open to a bunch of different interpretations. Certainly my Surfer was a little bit different from Jim Starlin's Surfer, which was different from Stan Lee's Surfer, which is different from what Dan Slott is doing now. So he's a very elastic character. And I think I still probably come down on the side of he's better off slightly removed. Well, yeah. He's a great sidekick for the Fantastic Four, because those characters are very human and very relatable, and he's a little bit off from them. He's a really fascinating character in the way that he's developed over the years, because when they say when Stan Lee invented the Silver Surfer, well, Stan didn't really invent the Silver Surfer. Jack Kirby did, because he just drew him into the coming of Galactus, and Stan went, well, who's this? And Kirby's notion was, well, he's the herald of Galactus. He's the herald of God, basically, because God doesn't show up and knock on your door. He sends his flunky. And so the Surfer has this tragic background that I think makes him a lot more interesting than a lot of the cosmic characters. Right, and certainly when Stan was doing, when Stan's run with John Buscema was going on in the 60s, he, again, Surfer he was a reflection of what was going on in society at the time. I mean, those are very, very 60s sort of pop culture, almost flower children kind of movement reflection of what was going on, what was going on in society with racism and war and everything that kind of stew in the 1960s that we had. Stan, very beautifully used this alien character as his foil to tell stories about that. There's a lot of those stories really aren't about the surfer; they're about the stuff that's going on around him. Right? He's a great mechanism for us to step out of our humanity and look back at ourselves. I was writing both books at the time. Which never happens now. You either have to be working for Marvel or working for DC because they get very proprietary and they don't like you. They don't like you working the other side of the street at the same time. But I was writing Surfer for Marvel and Green Lantern for DC, so I just said, I think to my DC editor, I said, we should do a Green Lantern Silver Surfer crossover. And they went, okay, so sort of
What?
sort of as shockingly simple as that was, they went, yeah, okay. And obviously, like editorially, the two companies got along a lot better then because the two companies were both still in New York, certainly. And there was a lot of friendships in the editorial staffs of both companies. They knew each other, they hung out with each other. Certain editors went back and forth between companies when they got a better offer. So that kind of stuff was a lot easier to set up in those days. And we just, I suggested it and they said, okay. And I don't know, within a few weeks we were working on it. And it also had something to do with the fact that was the, books were selling well then. So if you came up with an idea that they thought would sell, hell yes, let's do some more of those. And the sort of the side note was that we were working on Green Lantern Surfer, and then Marvel and DC, bottom fell out of the market. Marvel and DC decided that they were going to do Marvel versus DC, and I got hired to do that. And so the last page of Green Lantern Silver Surfer is kind of a lead-in to Marvel versus DC. That's the first appearance of like the box in the alley or something like that. So that wasn't actually the original ending page of Green Lantern Surfer. I had written something else, and then when Green Lantern Surfer, when they decided that they were going to definitely do Marvel versus DC, they had me rewrite the last page to kind of serve as a little bit of a lead-in, which means that somebody reading, Green Lantern Surfer now, 20 years later, gets to that last page and goes, what the hell is this? This doesn't have anything to do with the rest of the story. My favorite stuff is probably my creator-owned stuff, which is like not Marvel stuff, not DC stuff. It's like books like Shinku at Image and Samurai Heaven and Earth at Dark Horse. So those are always the ones that end up being more dear to you, is the stuff that you create from the ground floor. But my favorite stuff is just like at Marvel or DC is just like weird, odd stuff that, like, I loved doing Doctor Strange Fate because it was just like a one and done. There was a Daredevil story I did for Marvel Shadows and Light, which was their black and white book that Brian Stelfreeze drew. So there's a lot of like little odd gigs like that end up being your favorites, because when you do a little side story, you're generally left alone. There's nobody looking over your shoulder. One of my other favorite things is I did a Superman story with an artist called Doc Shaner, and it's basically Superman meeting the Iron Giant, which is one of my favorite movies. So people come and go, this looks like the Iron Giant. We go, no, that's I don't know why you would think that. But that was another thing where, DC asked me for a pitch for an Adventures of Superman story, which are one and dones. And I gave him that one and sort of insisted they hire Doc to draw it. And that was one of those where everything just came out like the way it was supposed to. The art, we were left alone on the story. The art's perfect. It's just like, that's my Superman. To me, that's my vision of Superman, and they let me tell it. Yeah, I wrote Witchblade for about 10 years. About 80 issues between 80 regular issues. I took a break in the middle, and then a bunch of specials. And, Witchblade was never a book that I even read, but I worked for a company called CrossGen in Florida. And when that place tanked, I had to go back to freelance because my children were weirdly attached to food. So, I went back to being a freelance. I was writing comics at CrossGen, so it was the same job basically. But Top Cow called me up and said, "Hey, what do you want to do?" And I said, "Well, I want to do the Magdalena because that's a really cool character, and I love the costume." And they said, "Yeah, it's great. How about you do Witchblade?" And I said, "Well, look, I don't know anything about Witchblade. I've never read it. I know what it is, but I can't give you an answer." So they said, "Well, we'll send you a box of books." So literally the next day, this box of like 80 issues of Witchblade shows up, and I have to start going through them. And, the concept was kind of cool. The concept was interesting to me. A lot of the issues kind of sucked. They were very much 90s comics in that sense. And a lot of the stories were kind of excuses for her clothes to fall off. So that she had the Witchblade armor on, which, was basically a metal bikini, which did not seem, if you're going to fight demons, it did not seem to me to be the best protection you could have against demons.
As usually happens in comics.
As happens, yeah. So I said, I think the concept is cool, but it's not like the kind of stories that a lot of these are not what I'm interested in telling. If you want me to do what I do, which is try to make a three-dimensional character that the readers care about, and having some sense of that you care about that person, and so you want to come back every month to find out what happens to them, whether they're in costume or just being a New York City cop or whatever was going to happen, was going to be of interest to you. Like when I wrote Green Lantern, my goal was to make sure that the audience cared about Kyle, whether he was doing Green Lantern things in costume or whether he was just being himself. If he was just, worried about paying the rent or who he was dating, or, I feel like you have to have both of those things. And comics are soap operas basically, so you want all of that stuff. And I said, if you want me to do what I do with Witchblade, I'm willing to give it a go. And to Top Cow's credit and my undying thanks to them, they said, yeah, go ahead and do what you do. And that's the last time we ever discussed, what state of undress she was in, or, so we immediately put her in armor. And it turned out that this book that I had never read turned out to be a really great fit because the character was really elastic. The concept was elastic. So we could do police procedural stories because she was a New York City detective. We could do supernatural stuff. We could do quasi-superhero stuff. We could do just crime stories. So I loved doing the book and never got bored on it because of the range of stories we could tell. It wasn't just the same sort of thing over and over. It was, if I got bored on the book, it would have been my own damn fault.
Doing like Marvel and DC books where, you have this stable of characters and they have very specific things that, we want you to do this. Like, like you're saying, most of the time when you're getting to have free range of like a character like Superman, it's almost like you're sneaking into it. Like going from like that to doing something on Top Cow that's like an independent comic book company, and you say, I want to do it like this, and they just say, okay, what are the benefits of that versus, either or? Like, what's the pros and cons of both situations?
It's different answers for different writers, and certainly it's different answers for different editors, because some editors, want to be creatively involved. They want to have their, those are guys that I call thumbprint editors. They got to put their thumbprint on the story in some ways. And some editors don't want to do that. They just, I edit stuff as well. And I always feel like my job as an editor is not to force the creative team to tell my story. My job as the editor is to help the creative team tell their story the best way they can. So it's really less about companies and characters for me as it is about editors. When you find an editor that you click with, and whatever level of involvement that is, you tend to try to stick with them because it's a good relationship. It's a good marriage. So the more popular the character, the more money the character makes, the more recognizable the character, the more people you have looking over your shoulder. If you do Batman, you're going to have a lot of people looking over your shoulder. If you do Dr. Fate, nobody cares. So you can get away with a lot more if you're doing stories that for a character that nobody pays attention to. That was actually advice from Jim Starlin early on in my career, which was try to get on books that aren't selling that great because you have a lot more freedom to do what you want to do. And then, if the book starts to sell well and people pay attention and the book starts to, be profitable for the company, success has many fathers, failure's an orphan. So if you turn a book into a success, everybody kind of gets in line to take some credit for it.
Is it kind of like a little bit of a double-edged sword where you jump onto something like Dr. Fate so that you don't have people looking over your shoulder, but because you excel at your job, all of a sudden people are trying to put their input into something that you didn't necessarily have a lot of input in? Yeah,
it's just the nature of the beast. And ultimately you're at Marvel or DC or any company really, if you're doing, Star Wars books or Aliens or something like that, you are ultimately playing with somebody else's toys. Right. And they're not yours. They will let you know how they want you to play with their toys, or they will at least stop you from doing anything overly drastic or dramatic with their toys if they don't want you to. And you have to know that going in. I've seen, you hear about creators who get bent out of shape because, well, they didn't let me tell my story about character X, Y, or Z. I'm not going to say any specific characters because I don't want you to think I'm talking about any specific creators. But if you want to know that list, I'll meet you outside. And you can give me a $20 bill and I'll tell you. But there's always editorial push and pull. And I think there's more editorial input now because these franchises are worth not millions of dollars, billions of dollars since they've crossed over into film and TV, besides the merchandise that goes along with them. There's a huge amount of money riding on this stuff. 20 years ago, there wasn't. 20 years ago, we were sort of, they just let us do what we wanted to do a lot more. Now there's more input because there's more at stake. So I think writers have it a little easier than artists because we can juggle different projects. I can do creator-owned stuff and I can do company-owned stuff in the same month and sort of scratch both itches. For artists, it's harder because you really have to pick one or the other. You basically, with very few exceptions, artists can draw one book a month, if that. So they have to decide whether they're going to be, drawing Batman or Superman or Spider-Man, or they're going to go do their own thing. You can't have it both ways as an artist for the most part. Well, there are characters that you just don't connect with, and that's obviously different for different creators. There are characters that I could plug into very easily, Superman or Batman or Spider-Man. I felt like I got them. Character like Sarah Pazzini in Witchblade, sort of like I'm not a female police detective in New York City, but I grew up near New York. I know the city. I know different cops, and I know a woman or two. So I felt like I could distill all that into a character that I could, sort of hang some flesh on those bones and have her seem like a real person. But there are characters that that just don't work for you. And I've talked about this with other creators. Like Wonder Woman, I think is a great character. I don't think I could write her because I don't have a way into her character. And obviously other writers have done amazing work on the character, but I don't think I ever would find that, other than, you come in and you tell one story. I'm talking about more doing a protracted run on a book. You really have to find a way into that character that works for you so that you can go to that well. I did Superboy for a year for DC, and like a third of the way into the run, I figured out I don't really care. I don't like this kid's a jerk, which is the way the character was set up. But I enjoyed doing it. I liked the gig, but I never felt like I really found my way into the character because I ultimately was not interested in the travails of a 16-year-old, which is what that book needed to be about. I mean, he's a 16-year-old. And so after a year, I left the book because the editor and I couldn't decide on what the next year was going to be. And I had a couple of different notions of where I wanted to take the book, which was pretty far afield from where it was when I was in the first year, which was, Superboy in Hawaii. And I wanted to do some very different things with it, and he could never really figure out what he wanted. So, when you get onto a book where it just doesn't work, the best thing to do is, you fulfill your commitment, and then you step aside because it's not the right fit. You go look for something that tends to be the right fit, and you get into your run on the book and you know it. I mean, whether it's working or not, and the best thing is when it works, when it's a comfortable fit. Like I did 50 issues of Surfer, and probably with all the specials and everything, annuals and miniseries, over 100 issues of Green Lantern and over 100 issues of Witchblade. When you find a book like that really ends up being something that you can just keep doing, that's the best gift of all.
I think I have time for one more quick one. I'm going to grab Matt since he hasn't asked a question yet.
I'm just making shit up, man. I get the question, and I think you're right about the three guys that you mentioned. I don't know that if you asked any of those writers, that they would see that, because usually for us, we can't see the forest for the trees. We're too deep in the process of telling stories, just, making stuff up, for us to step back and go, well, this is what, this is my oeuvre. This is my, this is the theme of my career. And there's certainly somebody else could look at it and say, okay, here's what I think, you're doing overall, but we don't do that intentionally. We don't, we find themes that we go back to over and over because they just appeal to us, and that stuff's kind of rooted into our heads. And I think in a lot of ways that's stuff that you kind of discover again in that golden age of 10, 12, 13, where you're exposed to things. Like for me, it was John Carter Mars and Tarzan and Lord of the Rings and X-Men and Avengers, and so all of that stuff kind of boils down into whatever comes out of me. But I don't think we know it in our heads. But I think the only thing that I can say about looking back on what I've done is I've tried to do a diversity of material. I've tried to use as many muscles as I could to not tell the same story over and over. To do superheroes and science fiction and horror and just for my own sake and my own sanity, to do different things so that this doesn't become a grind. And certainly there are writers who, man, all they want to do is write the superheroes that they read when they were 10 years old, and that's cool. That's great. And those are often the guys that end up being the best superhero writers. It's because that's what that's what they love. That's what motivates them. For me, I don't love any specific genre. I don't, it's not like I just want to write X-Men comics. I want to write a lot of different stories because I like to read a lot of different stories. And so I actively try to stretch different muscles when I come up with creator owned stuff, or when I look for gigs, like what haven't I done, or what am I not doing now, so that I keep myself interested, so that I sit down at my desk every day. If story A that I'm working on just isn't going anywhere that day, I can hopefully switch over to something completely different and actually make some headway, because there's a diversity of material in front of me.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Ron, for joining us. It's been a pleasure, listening to you just kind of talk about your process and comic books, and it's our favorite thing ever. So thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thanks for coming, guys.